8-month pregnant wife visits doctor, only to see millionaire husband supporting mistress at prenatal checkup. Have you ever felt your entire world collapse in a single moment? Picture this. You're excited, anxious, and brimming with hope as you head for a routine prenatal appointment, only to discover your husband in the same doctor's office, standing alongside another pregnant woman. The whispers, the stolen glances, and that suffocating heartbeat pounding in your ears. It's a betrayal so sharp, you wonder if you'll ever recover. In today's gripping story, a devoted wife's world shatters when she uncovers her millionaire husband's biggest secret at the worst possible moment. Get ready for twists, tears, and ultimate retribution in this intense tale. Beatrice Harrington Stone first caught sight of Alexander Stone at a charity event hosted by the prestigious Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City. He was the charismatic billionaire sponsor everybody whispered about, tall, confident, and impossibly charming. That night, he offered to donate a new wing to the hospital's pediatric unit, ensuring his name would forever be etched into the building's walls. But he also offered something else, a glance, a smile, and a conversation that made Beatrice feel like she was the only woman in the world. For a while, their love story seemed written in the stars. The tabloids loved covering them, the philanthropist and the artist. They were often dubbed. For Beatrice was a painter on the rise, known for her evocative watercolor landscapes. She'd grown up middle class, the daughter of a teacher and a mechanic, whereas Alexander had never known anything but wealth. Despite these differences, he treated her with utmost respect, or so she believed. He loved to show off her paintings to his business partners, encouraging them to commission her or invest in her upcoming gallery shows. In her eyes, he was the perfect husband, a man who used his wealth not just for profit, but also for philanthropic work. And for a while, he genuinely seemed to care. Their marriage was an opulent affair, a ceremony in the heart of Central Park, an after-party at the city's most expensive ballroom, and an exclusive honeymoon on a private island. Alexander spared no expense to prove his devotion to Beatrice. The paparazzi devoured every detail, building up this couple as some modern fairy tale. Even after the wedding frenzy died down, their life was a dream. They moved into a penthouse overlooking the Hudson River, floor-to-ceiling windows, marble floors, and a personal elevator that led directly into their foyer. Every day felt like an enchanted bubble of love and comfort. Yet, somewhere deep in Beatrice's mind, a small uneasiness always lingered. She'd heard the rumors, of course. Rumors that Alexander Stone was not just a gentle philanthropist, but also a cunning businessman with a ruthless side. She'd heard gossip from her own friends that Alexander's past relationships had ended abruptly, often in heartbreak for the other woman, but she brushed it all aside. He'd never shown her any reason to doubt him. On the contrary, he lavished her with gifts, made time for her despite his board meetings, and always supported her creative ventures. She felt safe. Then, after 2 years of marriage, the greatest news of all arrived. Beatrice was pregnant. Alexander was thrilled, or so he seemed. He declared they must prepare the best for his child, calling top-notch interior designers to create a stunning nursery, replete with plush toy animals, custom-made rocking chairs, and pastel walls that felt like something out of a storybook. Beatrice glowed with anticipation. She pictured a future of family vacations, bedtime stories, and a child who would be the bridge between her middle-class warmth and his gilded empire. Still, the bubble of happiness was not without occasional pinpricks. Alexander began returning home later than usual, citing urgent business deals that demanded his attention. The phone calls he received after midnight became more frequent. Sometimes, a wry grin crept onto his face when he thought Beatrice wasn't looking, leaving her to wonder if there was another side to him she didn't yet know. By the time Beatrice reached her second trimester, the demands of pregnancy made her more aware of every subtle shift in their life. Her emotional range intensified, and she caught herself glancing at Alexander's phone whenever it buzzed. She took note of the nights he spent away on business trips. She told herself that her hormones might be exaggerating everything, that she was simply anxious about impending motherhood. But a quiet voice inside whispered that something wasn't right. Nevertheless, she clung to the image of the life they'd built. There was still an undeniable affection she saw in Alexander's eyes whenever he stroked her baby bump or discussed possible names for their child. She told herself that no one was perfect and that trust was paramount. If anything was amiss, surely he'd tell her. After all, she was his wife, the mother of his future child. He wouldn't jeopardize that, would he? And so, like many who sense a storm in the distance but can't bear to face it, Beatrice kept her eyes on the horizon, hoping those ominous clouds would disperse on their own. The day started innocently enough. Beatrice had woken up feeling a bit queasy, so she decided to visit her obstetrician, Dr. Lydia Chan, for a checkup. She'd known Dr. Chan ever since her college roommate recommended her a warm, motherly figure who took her time with patients, ensuring they felt comfortable every step of the journey. She practiced at a private clinic affiliated with Mount Sinai, which reassured Beatrice with the high caliber of care. Alexander was supposed to be out of town for a conference in Boston, discussing potential mergers for his ever-expanding company. Beatrice almost rescheduled her appointment so he could come along, but her discomfort was growing. Dr. Chan, ever the professional, suggested an earlier visit rather than waiting. So Beatrice took an Uber to the clinic, heart fluttering with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Routine checkups always carried that pinch of nerves after all. Upon arriving, she noticed the waiting area was more crowded than usual. Perhaps there had been a scheduling glitch, or perhaps more women were seeking care today. She felt a twinge of anxiety. Hospitals and clinics always had that underlying tension for her. She took a seat, flipping through a magazine absent-mindedly, gazing at the photos of celebrities and reading about their pregnancies. In one spread, she recognized a mention of her husband's philanthropic deeds, stating that Alexander Stone had recently contributed to a children's welfare fund in Los Angeles. Proud as she was to see him recognized publicly, she couldn't shake a slight queasiness that day. As the minutes passed, voices rose and fell around her. A young woman in her 20s waddled by, her baby bump prominent. A worried father clutched his wife's arm. Nurses scurried from one patient to another, apologizing for the delays. The faint smell of disinfectant hung in the air, melding with the lingering aroma of coffee from the lounge corner. Beatrice found herself drifting into a daydream. Soon, that woman with the big baby bump would be her, and Alexander would be by her side, doting on her, celebrating every milestone. Then a sudden hush seemed to permeate the waiting room. Beatrice sensed movement to her left. She glanced over. Through the glass door at the far side of the corridor, a couple entered, though couple might be too formal a word for them. The woman held onto the man's arm, leaning into him as if seeking emotional support. He whispered something to her, and she giggled softly. It took a few seconds for Beatrice's brain to process what her eyes were seeing. That man, with his perfectly tailored suit and polished Italian shoes, was none other than Alexander Stone. Her Alexander, except he wasn't supposed to be in town. And who was the woman clutching his arm? She had chestnut brown hair, striking green eyes, and a figure that suggested she was quite far along in her pregnancy, maybe even further than Beatrice. Shock and confusion crashed over Beatrice like a tidal wave. Her heart pounded in her chest and her palms went clammy. She blinked, hoping this was some bizarre hallucination, but it wasn't. Alexander and the mysterious woman were heading straight for the reception desk, speaking quietly with the nurse there. The nurse nodded and ushered them into another waiting area, presumably for a prenatal checkup. All the while, Alexander never looked around. It was as if his entire focus was on that woman. He stroked her back gently, exactly how he'd done for Beatrice whenever she'd felt nauseous. A wave of nausea now rose in her throat, but for entirely different reasons. In that moment, time seemed to slow. Beatrice felt as though she was plummeting off a great cliff with no parachute. Questions bombarded her mind. Was this a client from one of his philanthropic ventures? A friend he was helping out? But no, his behavior was too intimate. The protective hand, the tender gaze, she'd recognized that look in his eyes. He had that look whenever he was moved by her pain, her concerns. It was the look of a caring partner. She didn't realize it, but tears began gathering in her eyes. Her chest tightened, and she had to grip the armrests of her chair just to remain steady. All her earlier premonitions, the sense that something was off, erupted into a horrifying reality. The woman's belly was unmistakably round with child, and Alexander was there for her prenatal checkup, or so it seemed. Torn between confronting him immediately and waiting to see how this played out, Beatrice's mind spun. She couldn't move, her legs felt like lead. A few people in the waiting room caught sight of her expression and whispered among themselves, but nobody knew the story that was unraveling. She felt alone, vulnerable, like the walls were closing in. One thought slammed into her mind with jarring force. This was no misunderstanding. This was betrayal. And it was happening right in front of her. Dr. Chan's nurse called Beatrice's name. Automatically, she rose to her feet, heart hammering. She glided through the hallway, barely aware of her surroundings. She tried to calm her breathing, but her mind replayed the scene of Alexander escorting that other pregnant woman. Step by step, she felt her world growing more surreal. Inside the checkup room, Dr. Chan greeted her warmly, though she immediately noticed Beatrice's distress. "Are you feeling all right, my dear? You look pale." Her soft voice brimmed with concern. Beatrice tried to speak, but the words clung to her throat. She managed a faint nod and mumbled, "I just need some air." Something happened. She thought about telling Dr. Chan everything right then, about seeing her husband with another pregnant woman. But the swirl of confusion held her back. Dr. Chan proceeded with the routine checks: blood pressure, fetal heartbeat, measuring the growing belly. The whole time, Beatrice lay on the examination table, thoughts pounding like thunder. The baby's heartbeat was strong, echoing in the small ultrasound room like a faint drumbeat of hope. Despite her heartbreak, hearing that steady rhythm reminded her there was still a miracle growing inside her. Her baby deserved every bit of strength she could muster. After concluding the exam, Dr. Chan stepped out to fetch some additional test results, leaving Beatrice alone. That's when she heard voices filtering through the thin walls. At first, it was just muffled conversation, too faint to decipher. But then she recognized a low, commanding tone. Alexander's voice. He was speaking with another doctor, or maybe a nurse, presumably about the pregnant woman she'd seen earlier. Unable to resist, Beatrice opened the door a crack, just enough to see into the adjacent hallway. There he was, leaning against the wall, his jacket casually draped over his arm. Next to him stood the woman, looking tired and a bit anxious, her face betraying hopefulness as she listened to the doctor. Alexander nodded, then glanced around. For a second, Beatrice feared he might spot her, but he seemed too preoccupied, leaning in to whisper something to the woman. She smiled, gently rubbing her belly. Then the woman spoke. "Thank you, Alex, for being here. I know this wasn't planned, but you've done so much to support me already. I want our baby to have the best life possible." The phrase "our baby" shattered the last illusions in Beatrice's heart. This wasn't a mere friend. This wasn't a random philanthropic gesture. This was something deeply personal, a hidden life Alexander had been cultivating behind Beatrice's back. Her entire body trembled. A wave of heat surged up her spine, competing with a cold dread that made her fingertips numb. She nearly bolted into the hallway to confront him, but her body refused to move. Part of her was terrified of confirming this travesty, of demanding answers in a public corridor. Another part of her felt humiliated that strangers might witness the meltdown that was sure to follow. Abruptly, the woman turned and walked away with the doctor, likely heading for another exam. Alexander lingered, gazing absently after her, lost in thought. The painful weight of betrayal made Beatrice's pulse roar. She realized she had two choices: confront him right then or gather more information. She had to be strategic, if only to protect herself and her unborn child. The cunning side of her mind, a side she hardly recognized, told her to gather evidence because, once Alexander knew she had discovered his secret, he might twist the narrative to his advantage, and she, in her emotional state, might be the one left with nothing. Steadying herself, she closed the door softly and forced herself to breathe. She had to stay focused for her baby's sake. She wouldn't storm into the hallway in hysterics. She needed answers, needed a plan. When Dr. Chan returned, she found Beatrice upright, her jaw clenched. "Is there something wrong?" the doctor inquired gently. Beatrice hesitated, then forced a smile. "I'm fine. Just realized I forgot something in the waiting room." She left quickly, weaving through the corridors, her heart pounding. She spotted Alexander at the far end, talking to a nurse. This time, she managed to snap a photo from behind with her phone. It wasn't perfect evidence, but it was something. Then, gathering every ounce of composure, she slipped out of the clinic before he even noticed her. She'd find her own ride home. There was no way she could share a car with him right now, not after what she'd just witnessed. Outside, the bustling city traffic offered some solace. Horns blared, people hustled by, and the normalcy of life outside the clinic stung her eyes. She hailed a taxi, tears streaming down her face as she slid into the back seat. She gave the address of a cafe she frequented. She couldn't go straight home. Not yet. She needed space to think, to cry, to process the nuclear bomb that had just gone off in her life. Throughout the ride, she clutched her abdomen protectively. It was as if her baby could sense her anguish moving slightly within her. She whispered, "Shh, it's okay. I'm here. I'm here," as tears traced silent paths down her cheeks. In that raw moment, she vowed to be strong. For her baby, whatever happened next, she wouldn't break. She would find the truth, and she would see that justice was served, whether that meant divorcing Alexander or exposing him for the liar he was. And if necessary, she would fight for every penny to secure her child's future, because this was no petty heartbreak. This was the ultimate betrayal. Later that evening, Beatrice found herself pacing in the dimly lit living room of their penthouse. She'd returned home only after regaining some composure at the cafe, enough to keep her from collapsing into sobs at the doorman's greeting. Still, a sea of uncertainty churned within her. She could hardly look at the lavish surroundings without recalling how it all came from Alexander's fortune. Now, every piece of furniture felt tainted, every painting on the wall a silent mockery of her faith in him. Alexander wasn't home yet. Hours passed, and the city lights sparkled against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Usually, she'd text or call to check on him, to ask if he'd eaten or if he needed anything. Not tonight. Tonight, she felt like a stranger in her own marriage. Finally, around midnight, the elevator pinged. Alexander stepped into the foyer, looking exhausted but strangely satisfied, like a man who'd just accomplished a critical mission. He removed his jacket, hung it on the brass coat rack, and walked into the living room where Beatrice stood, arms folded across her chest. "Hey, darling," he began, forcing a tired smile. "Sorry I'm late. The meeting in Boston ran over, And traffic was insane coming back from the airport. He loosened his tie. You know how it is with last-minute flights. She stared at him, disbelief and hurt waging a storm in her eyes. His blatant lie about being in Boston made her stomach churn. She forced a tight smile, feeling her pulse spike. Boston, huh? How was the flight? He shrugged. Bumpy. But that's not unusual this time of year. Beatrice swallowed the lump in her throat. She wanted to scream at him, to hurl accusations, but something restrained her. Perhaps it was the mental echo of that earlier resolve. Gather evidence, plan carefully, protect yourself and your baby. Instead, she nodded. So, you've had a long day. You should get some rest. He eyed her suspiciously. You're not upset? She paused. Why would I be upset? He blinked, seemingly uncertain if it was a trick question. I don't know. You just look tense. She let out a soft laugh devoid of humor. Pregnancy hormones, I guess. I had a checkup today with Dr. Jan. Apparently everything's normal. Alexander's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, but enough for Beatrice to catch it. He forced a smile. That's great news. I'm sorry I couldn't be there. The trip came up so suddenly, his lies were weaving themselves deeper, and with each fabricated thread, Beatrice's heart ached. She wanted to throttle him with the truth, to hurl the photo she'd taken in his face. But not yet. She told herself to be patient. She needed more than just a grainy picture. She needed the full scope of his betrayal, the reasons behind it, the financial entanglements, and how to shield herself from the potential devastation. They headed off to bed without further confrontation, each lying on opposite sides of the king-sized mattress. She replayed the day's events in her mind. The swirl of emotions kept her awake, but eventually exhaustion took over. The next morning, she awoke to Alexander showering. She crept to his office down the hall, determined to find answers. The office was locked, as usual, but she knew where he kept the spare key, behind the framed photo of them on their wedding day. Once inside, the subtle scent of leather and old books greeted her. Tall shelves lined the walls, filled with business texts, awards, and personal mementos, like the photograph of them at a fundraiser for abused children. She recalled how proud she'd been that day, standing next to him, thinking he was the kindest soul. She sat at his mahogany desk, powering up the computer. Her hands trembled on the keyboard, aware that she might be crossing lines, but equally resolute in her pursuit of truth. The homepage revealed a swirl of emails, financial statements, and business proposals. Beatrice knew enough about Alexander's business dealings to navigate the basics. Though she tread carefully, he might have set up special security measures. Sure enough, certain files were password protected. She tried her birth date, their wedding date, even the name of his mother, but none worked. Frustrated, she scanned the rest of his emails. Between countless messages from executives, bankers, and philanthropic committees, she found receipts for lavish dinners, hotel bookings, and jewelry purchases that didn't correspond with anything she had ever received. One item caught her eye in particular, a reservation at a high-end boutique maternity spa. The name Vanessa Monroe was clearly mentioned in the email. The date matched the day he was supposedly in Boston. A cold wave of realization washed over her. So the woman had a name, Vanessa Monroe, a name that now hung like a ghost between Beatrice and her husband's once blissful life. She transferred as many suspicious emails and documents as she could onto a flash drive she found in the desk drawer. She even took pictures with her phone as an additional backup. Her nerves sizzled with the risk Alexander could walk in at any moment. But she kept going, determined to compile every piece of evidence. When she finally heard the water shut off in the master bathroom, she rushed out of the office, locking it behind her, returning the key to its hiding spot. Adrenaline coursed through her veins. She felt guilty, angry, and heartbreakingly betrayed all at once. But she also felt a flicker of triumph. She had a name and some evidence. That was a start. She found Alexander in the kitchen, hair damp, sipping coffee. He flashed her a charming smile, the kind that once melted her heart. "Morning, sweetheart," he said, as if he were still the devoted husband. She managed a nod, quietly taking a mug for herself, but she couldn't meet his gaze. Fear and fury warred in her soul, but she played it cool. From that point on, every interaction with him felt like a charade. Beatrice saw through his every move, every breath, every sweet word. She wondered how long this affair had been going on, how he could sit across from her at dinner, feigning love while supporting another pregnant woman. The magnitude of his betrayal was staggering. Throughout that day, she planned her next steps in secret. She confided in no one, not even her best friend, because she worried about word getting out too soon. She needed to confront him when she was armed with enough evidence to protect herself and her baby, no matter how ugly it got, and something told her it would get very ugly. Although Beatrice remained in the dark about Vanessa Monroe's past, the other woman's life had been woven into Alexander's months earlier. Vanessa had been an up-and-coming model and socialite, frequently mingling at luxurious events. They first crossed paths at a gala for a cancer research foundation where Vanessa had been invited as a special ambassador. She had a knack for charming, wealthy benefactors, and Alexander Stone was no exception. She'd recognized Alexander's face from financial magazines, the same face that women whispered about: handsome, wealthy, philanthropic. She saw more than just a potential lover. She saw a secure future. Alexander, for his part, was initially captivated by Vanessa's youthful energy. She was lively, ambitious, with eyes that glimmered whenever she looked at him. Their flirtations evolved into rendezvous at exclusive restaurants, weekend getaways under the guise of business trips, and eventually a hidden affair that spanned multiple cities. Vanessa reveled in the lavish attention he showered upon her. Designer handbags from Hermes, diamond earrings from Cartier, and sexy invitations to the most exclusive parties. Yet, she also sensed a certain distance in Alexander's demeanor. He would never speak of leaving his wife outright, never discuss a long-term future together. Even so, she convinced herself that if she gave him enough love and excitement, eventually he'd choose her entirely. After all, she considered herself an upgrade, young, beautiful, daring. But when she discovered she was pregnant, the euphoria was mixed with apprehension. She knew Alexander had a public marriage to protect. She wasn't naive. She understood that many men might abandon their mistresses once a child entered the equation. Instead, Alexander showed cautious support, ensuring she had medical care and the finest prenatal luxuries. Though he never promised to divorce Beatrice, he spoke gently about providing for Vanessa and the baby, about ensuring they never lacked anything. This was enough to fuel Vanessa's hope that maybe, just maybe, she would eventually become Mrs. Stone. That day at the clinic, when Alexander held her hand, she felt certain her future was secured. She never expected that Beatrice might be lurking in the same hallway, discovering the bitter truth. In Vanessa's mind, fate was aligning in her favor. She had the backing of a millionaire, a child who could bind them together, and a lifestyle that promised comfort beyond her wildest dreams. Little did she know, fate had other plans. Plans that would soon bring every hidden lie out into the open, pitting her interests against Beatrice's in a storm that would engulf them all. Over the next several days, Beatrice carefully documented everything she could about Alexander's affair. She even considered hiring a private investigator, but hesitated. She needed someone discreet, someone she could trust implicitly. Then she thought of Javier Ortiz, an acquaintance from art circles who occasionally freelanced as a photographer for tabloids. If anyone could dig up information quietly, it was him. She reached out with a cryptic text. "Hey Javier, I have a sensitive project. Need your camera skills and utmost discretion." "Are you in?" The reply came quickly. "Anything for you, B." When and where? They met at a small, unassuming coffee shop in Queens, far from the usual Manhattan hotspots. She wore large sunglasses and a scarf, feeling slightly ridiculous, but also determined not to be recognized. After all, pictures of her and Alexander still occasionally popped up in society pages. She explained enough of the situation to make Javier understand she was dealing with personal betrayal. His expression grew serious. "I'm sorry, B. I'd hoped your marriage was the real deal." She swallowed hard. "I did too, but now I need proof, photos, dates, times, whatever you can get. I want to see how often they meet, where they go, how far along she is. Can you do that?" He leaned forward. "I can, but this might get messy. Are you sure you want to see it all?" Her eyes brimmed with tears, but she held them back. "I have to," she whispered, "for the baby. For my sanity." Javier nodded, clasping her hand in silent reassurance. He promised to remain invisible, to track Alexander's movements without attracting suspicion. They parted ways, each with a grim sense of purpose. Beatrice prayed she wasn't making a mistake, but she also felt a sharp resolve rising within her. She wouldn't be a doormat. She'd learned from childhood to fight for what mattered. Meanwhile, Alexander carried on his double life. He'd wake beside Beatrice, share a quick breakfast, then depart for the office. Occasionally, he'd text her midday with affectionate notes about craving one of her homemade soups or checking on her health. Then he'd slip away to meet Vanessa, ensuring she was comfortable in her posh new apartment that he paid for under a shell company's name. Every so often, he'd check on her medical bills to make sure everything was covered discreetly. He lived in a state of constant tension, though he believed he was skilled enough to juggle both worlds without detection. But the walls were closing in. Javier's camera lens captured Alexander and Vanessa at intimate luncheons, romantic strolls through Central Park, even entering a high-end jewelry store after hours. On one particularly brazen day, Xavier photographed them entering a private prenatal class designed for wealthy couples. The images, time-stamped and crystal clear, formed a damning scrapbook of infidelity. A week later, Javier handed Beatrice the folder. She studied each photo, her stomach churning. There was Alexander, laughing with Vanessa, hands on her pregnant belly. There he was again, guiding her out of a limousine, his eyes tender with concern. The final photo showed Vanessa modeling a ring in a jewelry store, while Alexander stood behind her, looking as though he was about to purchase it. Nausea welled in Beatrice's chest. Part of her had still clung to the vain hope that this was a misunderstanding. But the pictures obliterated any last illusions. Tears streamed down her face, and she clutched her baby bump protectively. "How could he do this?" she whispered. "He's planning an entire life with her." Javier reached across the table. "I'm sorry. If you want to expose him, these photos will help. Or if you just need them for legal protection, they're yours to use." Beatrice inhaled shakily. Legal protection, yes, that was her next move. She knew a high-powered divorce attorney from her art circles, a woman known for dealing with complex, high-stakes cases. Maybe it was time to schedule a consultation. But as she closed the folder, she realized that confronting Alexander directly would soon be unavoidable. She had the proof, she had the heartbreak, and she had her unborn child to consider. Beatrice found herself at the law offices of Fiona Lambert, a renowned attorney who specialized in representing individuals up against wealthy, powerful spouses. The firm's reception area boasted sleek, modern decor, and the receptionist greeted Beatrice with polished courtesy. But beneath her calm demeanor, Beatrice's nerves twisted like a coiled spring. Fiona Lambert was a tall woman in her early 50s, with a short, stylish haircut and sharp brown eyes that could pierce through any deception. She ushered Beatrice into a private conference room, offering her bottled water. Once they were seated, Fiona folded her hands. I've reviewed your initial email, Miss S. Stone, and I understand you suspect your husband of infidelity. Could you tell me everything? Hands trembling, Beatrice recounted the doctor's office incident, the discovery of Vanessa Monroe, the receipts, the private detective's photos. Fiona listened intently, taking notes with practiced efficiency. When Beatrice finished, Fiona leaned back in her chair, contemplating the information. Alexander Stone is a formidable man with considerable resources, the lawyer mused. We need a strategy that ensures you and your baby are protected. That means financial security, custody rights, and potentially moral damages, though that's harder to prove. The photographs and financial records you have are compelling. Beatrice swallowed hard. I'm worried he'll manipulate everything and leave me with nothing. Fiona offered a reassuring nod. Trust me, Miss S. Stone, he won't walk away without consequences. We can demand a full accounting of his assets, secure spousal and child support, and file for divorce citing marital misconduct. However, this process might be protracted and messy. Are you prepared for that? Beatrice pressed a hand to her belly, anxiety warring with a protective resolve. I have to be. My priority is the baby. They spent the next hour discussing legal intricacies, from prenuptial agreements of which there was a brief one, but mostly designed to protect his business, to the possibility of media fallout. Fiona explained that high-profile divorces often attract press, and this could get public. Beatrice shuddered at the thought, but if that was the price of her freedom and security, so be it. When their meeting ended, Beatrice left with a stack of documents to review and sign. Outside, the city roared with lunchtime traffic. She walked aimlessly for blocks, thoughts swirling. She felt a surge of righteous anger. She might still be pregnant, still feeling heartbreak, but she was no victim. She would fight for her child's future, no matter how vicious the battle became. That evening, she made a crucial decision. She'd confront Alexander before filing. She wouldn't blindside him with the divorce papers. She wanted to see his face, to hear his excuses, and to ensure he knew exactly why she was leaving. She also wanted to gauge if there was any shred of remorse in him. Maybe it was foolish, but she needed that closure. She planned a quiet dinner at home, cooking one of his favorite meals, rosemary lamb chops with roasted vegetables. Her hands shook as she stirred the sauce, recalling how, in happier days, she used to surprise him with candle-lit dinners. Now, she was orchestrating a showdown that could end their marriage. When Alexander arrived, he smiled at the delicious aroma. "Wow, you're spoiling me tonight," he teased, hanging up his coat. She forced a sweet smile, offering him a glass of wine. She'd spent a while rehearsing how she might start the conversation, but her resolve wavered under the weight of seeing him act so normal, so affectionate. They sat at the dining table, the city lights twinkling outside. For a moment, she almost couldn't breathe. Then she steeled herself. "You can do this. You have to." She swallowed, setting her fork down. "Alexander," she began, voice shaking slightly. "I went to the doctor the other day, remember?" He nodded absently, chewing. "Yes, darling, everything was fine, right?" She drew a trembling breath. "Yes, but I saw something very unexpected that day." He looked up, a hint of concern crossing his features. "What do you mean?" Her heart pounded so hard, she feared it would burst. She met his eyes, willing herself not to cry. "I saw you, Alexander, supporting another pregnant woman." "I know about Vanessa." Everything froze. The color seemed to drain from his face. His fork clattered onto the plate. He stared at her, mouth slightly open, trying to form words but failing. Beatrice fought to keep her voice steady. "Stop lying to me about Boston trips. I saw you at the clinic. I've got photographs, hotel receipts, everything." For a moment, he looked like a cornered animal, eyes darting. Then he exhaled, face twisting into something akin to pity or resignation. I can explain." She let out a bitter laugh. "Explain that you've been cheating on me for months?" That you've impregnated another woman while I'm carrying your child? Go ahead, explain. He pushed his chair back, running a hand through his hair. It was a mistake, an affair that got out of hand. I never wanted to hurt you. She glared at him, tears stinging her eyes. Well, you did. You humiliated me. In the same doctor's office where I go to care for our baby. He buried his face in his hands momentarily, then looked up. It's complicated, B. Vanessa, she was going through a difficult time. I was just trying to help. She shook her head, disgust welling up. Don't spin this as charity. You were doing more than helping. You were living a double life. He reached for her hand, but she pulled away, revulsion halting any contact. Beatrice, he said, voice trembling, please believe me. I'm not leaving you. It's you I love. I only stayed involved with Vanessa because she stood up abruptly, nearly toppling her chair. Enough. Do you think I care about your excuses? I have photos of you going to a prenatal class with her, for God's sake. Did you think you could hide it forever? His eyes flickered with something like guilt. I don't know what I was going to do. I was caught in a mess, but we can work this out. I'll tell Vanessa I want nothing more to do with her. We can just, a bitter rage flared in her chest. Work this out? Are you insane? You think I can forgive you for this? For lying every day? For impregnating another woman at the same time as me? No. We're done, Alexander. He paled. You want a divorce? Her voice cracked. What do you expect? That I'd stay with a cheater who's about to have 2 children with 2 different women simultaneously? And you lied right to my face countless times. He slumped, eyes hollow. Beatrice, you have to understand. I did love you. I do, but I'm weak. I made a mistake. Don't ruin both our lives over this. She felt a sob rising, but she forced it down. Our lives are already ruined, Alexander. You did that the moment you slept with her, the moment you lied to me. A heavy silence fell. Finally, Alexander's tone hardened slightly, a defensive edge creeping in. If you go through with this, it won't be pretty. My lawyers. Don't you dare threaten me, she snapped, tears slipping down her cheeks. I've already talked to an attorney. I have evidence. This will be ugly for you as well. And if you try anything, I'll make sure the world knows exactly what kind of man you really are. He stared at her, caught between desperation and anger. You'd destroy me? She took a shaky breath, stepping away from the table. You destroyed us, Alexander. I'm just protecting myself and our baby. Now get out. Stay somewhere else tonight. I can't look at you. He remained motionless, as though he couldn't believe what was happening. Then, slowly, he rose from the table. He grabbed his coat, casting one last pleading glance at her. She turned away, not trusting herself to remain composed. A few seconds later, she heard the elevator doors close behind him. Beatrice sank to her knees, burying her face in her hands, sobbing into the cold marble floor. The confrontation she'd dreaded was over, and it had gone exactly as she'd feared, bitter, heartbreaking, and final. Her entire married life was crumbling around her. Yet amid the despair, a glimmer of relief emerged. She had stood up to him. She had declared her boundaries. It wasn't the end of the battle, but a new chapter was beginning, one in which she would no longer be the naive, trusting wife. She would be a fighter for herself and her baby, and she would see Alexander Stone pay for every lie he had told. In the days following the confrontation, Alexander moved into a suite at the Ritz-Carlton, while Beatrice sought solace in her penthouse. Their once vibrant home now felt cavernous, haunted by memories of happier times. She cried often, yet she also found a fierce determination pushing her forward, fueled by the unborn life within her. Alexander tried calling, texting, even leaving apologetic voicemails that swung between remorse and veiled threats. She ignored most of them. Meanwhile, Vanessa Monroe, unaware that her affair had been exposed, continued her routine checkups, occasionally contacting Alexander for emotional and financial support. Unbeknownst to either woman, the tabloids were about to catch wind of the scandal. A paparazzo had snapped a photo of Alexander and Vanessa exiting the jewelry store, and rumors swirled that the famous philanthropist husband of an emerging artist was living a secret double life. The tabloids began calling Beatrice's agent, fishing for confirmation of a split or infidelity. Though Beatrice's agent tried to shield her, the whisper campaign had begun. One afternoon, a private courier delivered a letter to Beatrice. She opened it with trembling fingers. It was from Alexander's lawyers, couched in polite legal language, but laced with hostility. They essentially requested a private settlement arrangement, implying that if she insisted on a messy divorce, they would smear her reputation, question her mental fitness, citing emotional instability during pregnancy, and possibly drag her through a prolonged court battle. Beatrice read the lines, anger boiling. "He thinks he can bully me," she muttered to herself. She immediately called Fiona Lambert, scheduling an urgent meeting. Fiona's office was calm, quiet, offering a sharp contrast to the storm inside Beatrice's mind. When she arrived, Fiona scanned the document and scoffed. Typical intimidation tactics. They're trying to scare you into accepting a less favorable deal. Beatrice's voice trembled. "I can't believe he's doing this. We once loved each other." Fiona softened. Divorce can bring out the worst in people, especially when large sums of money are at stake. The good news is, we have strong evidence in your favor. If he wants to drag this through the mud, we're more than prepared. They discussed strategy. They'd file for divorce on grounds of adultery, seeking significant alimony and child support. They'd also demand a fair portion of assets, especially since Alexander's net worth had skyrocketed during the marriage. Fiona believed the negative publicity might encourage Alexander to settle quickly, but she prepared Beatrice for a possible war. Meanwhile, the press uncovered more pieces of the puzzle. A magazine reported seeing Alexander frequenting Vanessa's apartment complex. Rumors claimed an unnamed socialite Mistress was also pregnant by him. Online forums buzzed with speculation and moral outrage. Some gossipers claimed Beatrice had driven him away. Others painted Alexander as the ultimate villain. The narrative was spinning out of control, and neither Alexander nor Beatrice could fully stop it. But the tabloids' intrusion wasn't the worst part. The emotional toll weighed heavily on Beatrice, who was well into her third trimester, struggling with swelling feet, sleepless nights, and the heartbreak of a ruptured marriage. She found a confidant in her art studio, pouring her turmoil onto canvases in haunting shades of grey and crimson. She also found comfort in small gestures of kindness, like the daily calls from her mother, who lived in a different state, worried sick about her daughter's well-being. One evening, as she was leaving her studio, she found Vanessa waiting outside, her face drawn. Beatrice's heart lurched. How had the mistress found her? Fear and rage churned in her belly. She almost turned to leave, but Vanessa raised a hand in a gesture of peace. "Beatrice?" she called softly. I need to speak to you." Beatrice squared her shoulders. "How did you know I'd be here?" Vanessa sighed, looking unusually vulnerable. "I followed you from your penthouse. I had to see you because Alexander, he's been distant. I heard rumors about a divorce. I'm worried about the baby, about me, about everything." Beatrice trembled with anger. "You're worried?" she spat. "You're the one who slept with my husband behind my back. Why would I give you the time of day?" Tears welled in Vanessa's eyes. "I know I have no right to ask for sympathy, but you don't understand. Alexander told me he was unhappy, that your marriage was practically over. He said he was just staying with you out of obligation. I believed him. Now he barely responds to my calls. I'm scared he'll abandon me too. Beatrice could hardly breathe, her pulse throbbing in her temples. The nerve of this woman. Yet, looking closer, she saw genuine fear in Vanessa's eyes. Was she also manipulated? The thought made her own anger twist in confusion. She took a shaky breath. If you think I'm going to help you, you're delusional. You're carrying my husband's child. You can imagine how that feels. Vanessa brushed away tears. I know, I'm sorry, I truly am. But now I see Alexander for who he is. He's not the man I thought. He lied to me too. He made promises. Beatrice scowled, but her voice trembled with empathy she wished she didn't feel. He's turned both our lives into a nightmare. Don't expect me to fix it. Vanessa nodded, her expression bleak. I just wanted you to know I never intended to ruin your marriage. I only realized too late that I was a pawn. Now I'm about to be a single mother, too. And I have nowhere near your resources. Beatrice's chest tightened, remembering her own vulnerable child. She hated Vanessa for her role in the betrayal, but she also recognized that Alexander was the orchestrator. Silence stretched between them. Finally, Vanessa turned to leave, shoulders sagging. I'll go. Sorry for disturbing you. Beatrice found herself calling after her, hating herself for doing it, but unable to stop. Vanessa, I don't know what's going to happen with Alexander, but if he tries to cut you off financially, you should get a lawyer. Don't let him bully you. Vanessa nodded, tears glistening on her cheeks, then walked away. The strangest sense of sorrow swept through Beatrice as she watched the mistress's figure disappear down the street. She was angry, betrayed, but she also saw how Alexander's manipulations had entangled them both in a web of deceit. We're both carrying his children, she realized bitterly, and neither of us truly won. Still, that brief encounter only solidified Beatrice's determination to proceed with the divorce. She wouldn't waver. Alexander Stone would learn that actions have consequences he couldn't buy his way out of so easily. The divorce case exploded into a public spectacle. Beatrice filed her petition, citing adultery and emotional distress. Alexander's lawyers responded with a barrage of counterclaims, painting Beatrice as paranoid and accusing her of attempting to leverage the scandal for financial gain. The media devoured the story, pitting the wronged wife against the philandering billionaire. Vanessa Monroe's pregnancy became a tabloid fixture, with paparazzi chasing her down for quotes, fueling further drama. Court proceedings began, and tensions soared. Fiona Lambert led Beatrice's legal team with unwavering resolve, presenting photos, receipts, and testimonies that painted Alexander as a man who'd willfully betrayed his marital vows. To the shock of many, Vanessa also testified, confirming the affair and revealing how Alexander had paid her bills and promised long-term support. Her tearful admission in the courtroom left Alexander cornered. Beatrice sat, pregnant belly evident under her conservative dress, listening to every word with a mixture of pain and grim satisfaction. She watched Alexander squirm in his seat, looking haggard and haunted by the glare of cameras. The press was relentless, capturing every moment of this high-profile meltdown. Finally, after weeks of heated arguments, legal back and forth, and emotional testimony, the judge delivered the ruling. The marriage was dissolved. Beatrice was awarded a substantial settlement, including half of the marital assets acquired during their marriage, ongoing spousal support, and robust child support for her baby. Additionally, the judge admonished Alexander for his duplicity, which only further tarnished his public image. It was a victory, but it felt bittersweet. Beatrice exited the courthouse, cameras flashing, a dozen reporters yelling questions. She shielded her face, ignoring them, focusing on the sense of relief coursing through her veins. She was free now, free from the lies, the betrayal, the toxic charade. The heartbreak still stung, but at least she had a measure of justice and financial security for her baby's future. Alexander slunk away through a side entrance, refusing interviews, face drawn. Word spread that his business empire had suffered, with stock prices dropping due to the negative press. Some of his partnerships were severed. Philanthropic donors hesitated to be associated with him, and the man who once seemed untouchable was left scrambling to salvage what remained of his reputation. Karma had landed its first blow. Vanessa, for her part, filed her own paternity suit to secure support for her child. With the court ruling on Beatrice's side, it gave Vanessa's case more weight. Rumor had it that Alexander grudgingly agreed to a settlement to avoid another messy trial. Thus, he was forced to bankroll both children he had fathered and two separate households, ensuring neither Beatrice nor Vanessa had to worry about finances. That outcome was the ultimate irony. The man who tried to juggle two pregnant women ended up saddled with lifelong accountability for both. Weeks later, Beatrice gave birth to a healthy baby girl. Holding her daughter in her arms, she felt a rush of overwhelming love. She named her Aurora, symbolizing the dawn of a new era in her life. She vowed to raise her child in a world free from deceit and toxicity. As for Alexander, she informed the nurse that his name was not to be listed on the birthing room's approved visitors. If he wanted a relationship with Aurora, he'd have to earn it through legal channels and prove himself worthy. One day, as she rocked Aurora to sleep in the penthouse that now legally belonged to her, Beatrice gazed out at the city skyline. She thought of the many nights she'd cried over Alexander, wondering how she'd ever find the strength to move on. Yet here she was, stronger than she ever thought possible. She had confronted betrayal, faced it down in court, and emerged victorious, not just financially, but emotionally. She had discovered the fierce love of a mother, a love that could conquer heartbreak and rebuild a broken life. And so, in the quiet hush of that moment, she whispered a silent prayer of gratitude. She thanked whatever higher power had guided her steps, leading her to uncover Alexander's deceit before it was too late. She thanked her baby for giving her the courage to fight back. And she even thanked the pain for forging her into a new woman, no longer naive, no longer passive. Karma had struck Alexander Stone hard, and as for Beatrice Stone, she had finally reclaimed her future. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this roller coaster journey. We witnessed how one woman's life crumbled under the weight of betrayal, only for her to rise stronger, proving that even the deepest wounds can pave the way for new beginnings. Lies, heartbreak, and secret pregnancies are no match for a mother's determination to protect her child and fight for justice. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you cheer for Beatrice's courageous stand, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. By doing so, you'll help us spread more stories of resilience, redemption, and the unbreakable spirit of those who refuse to be defined by their darkest moment. Don't miss our upcoming videos, where we'll uncover even more jaw-dropping tales that remind us, no matter how daunting the crisis, hope and strength can still triumph in the end.